Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Jason Silverman. Thanks for joining today's BlazeMeter webinar, Load Testing for Your Black Friday, Getting Ready for Any Peak Traffic Period. I'm going to turn things over to our presenter, Dave Caro. He's the developer advocate for open source technologies at BlazeMeter. Dave, over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Jason. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining. I know you're taking some time out of your day. I appreciate that. My goal will be to share information that will help you succeed on your peak days, whatever they are, not just a Black Friday. And I'll be giving a mix of high-level principles, sort of guidelines, and things that'll help you sort of have a stronger plan to begin with, and some detailed technical tips along the way. So there should be something for everyone. Before we get started, I just want to cover some housekeeping really quick. First of all, we are recording the session, and everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording in an email. That'll probably come out tomorrow. Now, during the webinar, you're welcome to ask any questions you'd like in the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll do our best to get to all those at the end of the webinar. Do me a favor, though, try to keep your questions on topic. Typically we get a lot of questions, and we can try to respond to them all. You'll have a chance to ask for a reach out from a BlazeMeter person at the end if you have some off-topic question you want help with, but try to keep your questions here on a topic. At the end of the webinar, there will indeed be a short survey that we would really appreciate your time. It's literally like 30 seconds to fill it out. Basically ask, did you find the webinar useful, and what would you do to improve it, or what did you find useful? Helps us to design these to make sure that we're meeting your needs out there. So without further ado, let's move forward here. So the first point here is that it's really never too early to start preparing for peak traffic. People will ask, well, so when do I start preparing for Black Friday, for instance? An example of the very large e-tailers out there, I did a webinar quite a few years ago with someone from Home Depot, and they literally start in February. So they sort of go through their Black Friday, they take a few weeks off, they take a deep breath, then they do a kind of a post-mortem, and then immediately in February they start planning forward for their Black Friday. Now, we don't all have that kind of resource and maybe that much time, so there's really the second kind of corollary here, which is at the very least, leave time for some fixes. So if you're thinking about doing testing, for goodness sakes, don't do your testing 2 weeks before you're going to go live. Or 2 weeks before your big event or whatever it is, right? You may think you're ready, but you really want to find stuff that you can fix, and you want to have enough time to make improvements before the big day. The last thing you want to do is be in sort of a futile, we don't have enough time to fix it anyway kind of mindset. You want to be able to tune and optimize and leave the very, the final testing is really, lock it down, test it one last time, and then you're good, right? So leave time for fixes at the end. So let's take a second and just kind of, my goal is to leave you all sort of very committed to doing the right thing for your companies, to prevent you from sort of costly lessons learned. So let's take a look at sort of why we should be doing this in the first place. And really the big reason is that the costs of failing to test and then having surprises happen when real demand arrives is pretty high. So the first one is direct loss of money. Obviously, if you have a big day, whether it's a product launch, whether it's Black Friday, whether it's some sort of promotion that you're spending a lot of money on, if you are unable to meet the demand and you crash or you slow down, you're going to lose significant amounts of money, and that's a direct loss of money. The second cost really, though, is reputation. And in this day and age of people jumping on Twitter and Facebook, you don't want to leave a lot of people unsatisfied, because not only are they going to be upset, but they're going to spread the word, and so your reputation would take a pretty good hit, and that can hurt future business, of course, and not just the business you lose that day, but really where your business goes going forward. And related to that is immediate churn. So let's say the big day is happening. Let's say if, the easiest one to look at is when multiple people are having a peak day, whether that be people selling flowers for Mother's Day or Valentine's Day, or whether that be for the holiday season for shopping. You will lose people immediately, and they will roll over to competitors, right? And anytime we build up a customer base, we want to retain them, and churning is when they leave for another solution, or they just stop using a solution altogether. The last thing you want is to have that happen. So you don't want to have that. That's kind of a secondary effect. Again, it hurts your revenue, not just that day, but going forward. And the last one here is actually kind of the flip side of that, the snowball effect, which is that if you manage to stay online on a day when others are having issues, you're going to gain additional traffic. It's going to grow on top of what you anticipated you're going to have, because suddenly people can't go to the other site they were going to go to, and they're going to find you. This is generally a really good thing. Which is obviously you're going to get more business. But in doing your planning for peak testing, you need to have some headroom so that if this happens, you can handle it. So rather than just looking at what your own customer base is likely to do on the big day, you may need a plan for what happens if you inherit someone else's customer base. So what makes an effective test? You know, we can all talk about different ways of doing tests and whatever, but we really need to start from the very beginning. What is it that makes a test useful? The last thing you want to do is spend a lot of time and energy and money to do testing that actually doesn't accomplish much, right? I mean, no one would actually set out to do that. Years ago, I wrote a white paper called, you know, the dreaded checkbox load test, how to avoid the dreaded checkbox load test. And really, a checkbox load test is a test that you did just so you could say you did a test, but actually isn't designed well enough to reveal whether you are really solving the problems that are important, right? So this is the advice, which is build tests based on reality, not happy paths. And you may or may not be familiar with the term happy path. A happy path is sort of the easily predicted path, which is, you know, in an e-commerce world, it's someone arrives at the home page or a landing page, they click on search, they search for an item, they put it in the cart, they check out, they put in their credit card details and shipping, and off they go. That's sort of a happy path. In the real world, it's much messier than that, right? People do a lot of different things, and they do things in interesting quantities and different patterns. And so you want to understand what those real patterns are, because that's what you want to test. You don't want to test the happy path, you want to test what real people do, right? So the first place to go looking for this information is analytics, whether that's Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics, anything you have that is actually keeping track of the behavior of your customers when they come to your site. Is obviously excellent information for understanding how do people really behave. And ideally, you want to look at other peak events on your with your customer base. If you have that information, it's best obviously to look at other peak events, but you can look at just if you have busy days, busy hours in a regular month, look at what people are doing during those busy hours. And the second source of information is if you have APM tools, application performance monitoring, they are going to let you know what your infrastructure is doing when your peak hours arrive, your peak minutes arrive. And hopefully you're lucky enough to have sort of enough of occasional pop that you can focus on times when things are busy. And what you want to do here is go looking for the hotspots, the areas that you know raise issues, but this also informs the first bullet, which is you may be able to get some pretty good analytics about what people really do, depending on how you have your APM configured. But at the very least, you want to know where are the key places where you get hotspots, and for the architecture you have, what are the key metrics that actually are the indicators in APM that show you whether you're on the right track or the wrong track. So you want to know what those are ahead of time. You don't want to go looking for those in the middle of a test. You want to already know what's interesting typically when your particular solution is under stress. And then the last of the first three bullets is logs. In the old days, this is really how we understood what people were doing on our website, is we would just look at log files. There's still a lot of data in the logs, both for the web front end and anything in the middle. And depending on the sophistication of the tools you have, you may want to make use of those logs. You can actually derive some pretty interesting statistics about exact rate of arrivals, exact time people spend on a page, that kind of thing from the logs. Now, the last three bullets are all human, right? Product managers, customer success people, and marketeers. And the reason they're here is that these people are very important for what you don't yet know that's probably not yet in your analytics, right? What is the plan for this year? What does product management have in mind for how the app is going to change and what they're hoping people are going to do with the behavior? Now, this is hope. This isn't necessarily facts, but you need to use this information to decide a little bit about your strategy, right? Customer success is here because if you have the kind of solution where there are people whose job is to make sure that customers are happy and they sort of touch base with customers and they know where the frustration points or where things are slow or whatever, you want to tap these people and figure out where are the areas that cause frustration that you hear back from our customers. The last bullet is probably by far the most important one, which is that generally peak traffic days happen when you've done some kind of a promotion. Marketing will spend a lot of money, sometimes millions and millions of dollars to drive traffic to your site, and they probably have some landing pages in mind. They absolutely do. They know where they're going to send people, and they may be using promo codes. And the thing you need to understand about promo codes is they really come in two flavors. One of them is sort of a promo code that everybody gets, like save 30 for saving 30% on your first order or something, right? That is a generic promo code, and it'll have its own implications, but they're not nearly as dire as a disposable promo code, which is a unique one per user, right? So if they're going to send users a promo code that's specific to them, anytime that promo code is used, it's probably pretty systematically expensive for your solution. There's more work being done with the database. You've got to look it up. You've got to mark it used, etc. Right? So find out if promo codes are being used. Promo codes in packaged e-commerce solutions are typically some of the biggest bottlenecks that exist, right? So you want to know about that stuff. So this was just, I wanted to spend a minute before we kind of go into the details of how you ramp up tests and all that to make sure that we're testing the right thing, right? You want to make sure that the tests you do actually inform you as to whether you're ready for what's really going to happen when the peak traffic arrives, right? So then shifting gears, how do I build up to doing the really big tests, right? And ostensibly that's a big part of what we're talking about today is how do I do large scale tests, right? And here's pretty much how we look at scaling from small to big to huge. And I'll go into more detail in a little bit, and I'll show some examples of some of this. But I just wanted to kind of set the stage. So we start with what we call sandbox testing, and that's really just to prove that your test itself does what it's supposed to do. Not at scale, not necessarily looking for response times here or finding breaking points. It's literally, does the test accomplish what you want it to accomplish? And at BlazeMeter, we provide a facility called the Sandbox, which never costs anything and is always available, and it comes up very quickly. And its design is that you can take a test and run it quickly and get feedback. Now, you probably would run a test first locally if you're running JMeter, for instance, but in the case of a complex test that has lots of moving parts and has different data files and all that, you want to be able to upload all of those into our environment and make sure that you don't have any hard-coded paths to the C drive on your machine, whatever, right? So that's what sandbox testing is for. And then we do calibration testing. And in calibration testing, we're actually still not getting to load testing. We're still not getting to performance testing. Our goal here is just to make sure that our testing apparatus is never part of the bottleneck, right? And so calibration is about making sure that the particular tests you've written, they may be particularly lightweight or particularly heavy. And by heavy, I mean they may use a lot of memory or CPU. And so you want to figure out how many users can you get out of a single engine with the tests that you've created. And so that's what calibration testing is all about. And so you run calibration testing to learn, how do I make sure that when I scale this up to bigger and bigger and bigger and huge, that my systems that are running a test aren't actually stressing for memory or CPU. And we'll look at how we do that in just a bit. Right, and then we get on to the main attraction, which is performance testing, right? And then when you're doing performance testing, some people are like, well, we think we can handle 50,000 users, so should we run a 50,000 person test, right? And the answer is almost certainly no. You should work your way up, right? So just as we did the sandbox and the calibrate to kind of make sure that certain things are working, now we want to, if we have a goal of getting to 50,000 or 100,000, start, even 10% of the way there. Just get a test done at 5,000 or so, and ramp it up slowly. Okay, so in these initial tests you're running, you want to have your ramp, which is the time you go from 0 users to your peak, to be gradual. And the reason why is you want to give your system enough time to get into enough trouble that you can see symptoms and to know roughly where those symptoms appear. If you're in a rush to get to a large number of users, then you don't really know at what load level you're currently facing problems, because you sort of pass through so many load levels before you notice that there's issues, right? So start your ramps gradual, and then build your tests up larger and larger and larger, right? So you want to plan to do a series of tests and to have the ramp be slow enough so that you can figure out where do things start going wrong. Now, you may need, in fact, to be ready for a sudden spike of users to arrive. If you're going to have a sale which sort of has a waiting page until 9 a.m. on some day, and then suddenly the site goes live, you're going to have a lot of people banging on your door all at once, right? And that's why we have the stress test here, which also could be known as a a peak test. Now, sometimes stress test is referred to just deliberately taking a solution, a system to failure on purpose to see what happens. I'm going to talk about that more in the vein of capacity planning in a second. In this case, I'm talking about really a spike test, which is if you have people arrive very quickly, can the system handle it? Now, the system is likely to have some symptoms of sort of strain when that happens, but you want to run that test, and then after the strain arrives, you want to scale back the load and see how well the system recovers. Because it's really important not only that you can handle that spike, but that after the spike arrives, it doesn't leave things tipped over and sideways and smoking on a server room floor, right? So you want to make sure that you don't need to restart anything, that the system will recover well after a stress. Now, the soak test is to look for a different problem. When you're on your peak day, if it's like Black Friday, it's a long day. And it's going to go on and on and on, and the traffic is going to keep going kind of relentlessly. And in one of the examples we're going to talk about, it had nothing to do with Black Friday, but was indeed a promotion that drew so much traffic that it ran, pretty much almost straight for 24 hours, and then it was done. So you need to actually plan to do a test that's long running. And the reason why you want to do this is there's certain things that will appear when you're running for a long time. One of them would be what's called a memory leak, right? Which is an application grabs some memory, uses it, but doesn't give it up when it's done. And so memory keeps getting accumulated and accumulated and accumulated and not freed up, and the system will run out of memory, and then you get unintended behavior, right? And typically the only way to solve that is a reboot, and you don't want to be rebooting in the middle of peak traffic, right? So you want to run a soak test. There are other things that will happen. You might find that you have queues that are unloading slower than you thought, and then only after you've been running them for quite a while do they actually kind of get all the way full, and then again you're going to get unpredicted behavior. Right? Now, the last bullet here is capacity planning. So I'm going to cover two things there. One is what sometimes is discussed as stress testing, which is deliberately taking your system to failure so that you know which components heat up the worst and where things break, right? In performance testing, if you're trying to get to your goal, we're going to probably encounter bottlenecks along the way, and we're going to kind of peel the onion. We're going to find a bottleneck, we're going to tune or adjust or code to fix that, and then we're going to push harder and we're going to find another bottleneck, and just kind of peel those layers off. In capacity planning, our goal here is to get a better understanding of if we need to scale to a whole different level, can we do it, and what do we need to do, and how much hardware is it going to take, and do we have technical problems to solve as well, right? So quite often people run into this when they're moving from a hosted sort of a data center solution to a cloud-based solution, and you need to understand, well, theoretically I have infinite capacity, but how much am I really going to need, and what do I really need to expand where? And so capacity planning is a bit of a luxury if you've already accomplished the rest, but in terms of understanding how do you scale even further, that's what you use capacity planning for, and having the ability to easily throw more load at it and then even throw more is kind of where you want to go at with that. So let's just talk about some patterns to watch for, and I'll admit that the graphs I'm about to show you are kind of simplified, but I want to simplify them so that we're very clear on kind of the different concepts we're dealing with here, right? So the first graph I'm going to show you, one of my colleagues, Rafael, calls this the Google search graph, which is the blue line there is showing you increasing numbers of users arriving, right, and more demand on the system. And yet the yellow line, which shows the response time, is going sideways, which is awesome. This basically means that as you deliver the load, that the system is totally able to keep up. Right, it's keeping up with the load. There's a little bit of variability in there, but it's keeping up with the load, and it's really the amount of load that you're throwing at it isn't making any material changes to the system, right? This is an enviable situation to be in on your peak day. Most of us are more likely to see something that more closely resembles this, which is that your application is indeed sensitive to load, and as the load increases, somewhere around here, you can see that the line went from sideways to starting to climb, right? And it's then following the arrival of more users. And in this case, you have a decision to make, which is that if this first line is 3/4 of a second and the second line, this kind of the second flat spot here, is 2 seconds, you might have a business decision and say, you know what, on our peak day we're okay with 2 seconds response time. You've got to know how your users behave and when they're more likely to abandon. But if this obviously is sort of 1 to 2 seconds down here, and this is 7 or 8 or 10 seconds up here, then clearly you've got to fix this problem before they arrive, right? So business decision for you, but you can kind of go either way with this. If you're okay with a little bit of being a little bit slower, up to you. Now the next situation is where as the load increases, and this is likely to happen at some point if you keep increasing the load is at some point you're going to start getting errors, right? And if you're seeing red on your graphs, you've got a problem that's got to be solved before you go live, right? Because if some percentage of users are going to encounter errors, it's flat out not acceptable, right? You can't really have people getting errors. If they're getting ready to pull out their credit card and they see errors, they're probably not too happy. So I'm going to shift gears again and talk about, so how do I test smart instead of just big? So this isn't all about just having a really big hammer and hitting it really hard and seeing what happens, right? Again, we want to do realistic testing, and one of the most, first thing I'm going to cover here really is that this notion of constructing realistic funnels. This is far and away the biggest tip I can give someone who's approaching this for the first time to avoid falling trap to, which is to actually not deliver a realistic funnel, not to have users drop off like they're supposed to. They need to drop off so that you have statistics that make sense in the real world. And I'll show you a slide in just a minute that makes this a little more obvious. And then one of these things that's actually, you know, people who are sort of on the bleeding edge, you might call the unicorns or whatever, they do a lot of things that, you know, with feature flags and turning features on and off on the fly. You don't have to necessarily be a rocket scientist to pull this off in your load testing. There's a pretty easy way using the BlazeMeter solution to send a message to your app, you send a message to your test telling it to pull something out of the test on the fly so you can continue rolling. And the reason you want to do that is so that you can, if you hit one bottleneck, you might want to look for others, and so you might want to take a problematic piece out of the picture. Most commonly this is third parties, but also could be just different features in your app, right? The third bullet here, decorate headers. And by the way, this is an overview. I'm going to go into more detail in each of these, right? So decorating headers so you can watch internals and APM. So I'll show you how it's very easy to enhance your test, to make it, to have your test show up in a more intelligent way on the back end if you're using APM tools, right? And then adjusting your request per seconds in flight to check if a system can recover. I mentioned that when you're doing stress testing or spike testing, you really want to figure out how well the system is going to recover. And you can do that either with using a plugin that lets you adjust the arrival rate ahead of time, but if you actually want to adjust based on seeing the problems happen on the fly, you can use the request per second feature, and I'll show that, I'll demo that as well. And then finally, if you use a content delivery network, you need to test it. Now, people don't like to test their content delivery networks because typically the networks are afraid of load tests, and you typically pay for traffic, right? So you need to build into your plan and your budget at least doing some amount of CDN testing, and I'll explain why in just a sec. First, let's talk about constructing a realistic funnel. So along the top, you can see this is sort of a path someone might take through a site. They arrive on the landing page, they become engaged, they do some browsing or some searching, they become activated, they decide they actually, hey, maybe I want to buy something, they put something in the cart, and along the way they finally get to purchasing. And it's not uncommon at all for there sort of be 10,000 people at the front end of this funnel and only 1,000 people at the end of this funnel. And maybe even smaller number at the end, right? Especially if you sort of add in, they've chosen to purchase, but then they get the shipping costs and, you know, et cetera, right? So you need to know where they drop off, right? And the reason that's important is that people take up different amounts of resources, and if you've got people loading carts full of products and then not checking out, that may be tying up space, and maybe tying up database capacity, maybe tying up RAM, depending on your solution. And you need a model for that when you're testing, because if you only push 1,000 users through here, sure, you're going to get 1,000 users happily purchasing, but that's not what's going to happen on the big day. So here's an example, technical tip, using JMeter. What you would do is there's something called a throughput controller. And I've given this name, name funnel 90% continue, but the magic happens right where that red box is, which is there's a throughput field, and you put in here the percentage of time that users passing through this part of your test should engage in what's enclosed inside this controller, right? If you look over on the left here, I have people arriving at the home page, and then 90% of them continue on to search for an item. And then nested within that, I have another funnel which says 60% of the people continue to put an item in the cart. And then of those people who put an item in a cart, 35% continue to check out. And I think in the example I'm about to show you, actually, I think I used 20% and 35 instead of 35. But check this out. So I'm going to run a little simulation here where I'm running 100 iterations through the test. And we can see that 100 people hit the home page, 90 people got to the search and exercised the search, and then of those 60% went on. 60% of 90 is 54, and then about 20% actually did a checkout. So if you've been told I need to be sure that 1,000 people can check out per hour, you can do the math here. You're going to need to run a lot of users through. So don't fall prey to a fake funnel. You want to have a realistic funnel, and then you want to make sure that the math makes sense. Okay, so tip number 2, we mentioned being able to toggle third-party or feature sets on and off on the fly. And the way you do this in JMeter is typically using an if controller. There are a few paths, but this is the one that's sort of right out of the box, easy to approach. In this case, I'm telling it that the condition for this test is the value of a property called third, which I'm going to set to no by default unless it's been explicitly set, and that this property must equal yes for the steps inside this controller to be taken, right? And so let's look at how we would actually set that before a test. So when you're getting ready to configure a test in BlazeMeter, you'll notice this JMeter properties thing right here, right? Now, if I click that, up will come a dialog box, and I can add this third and set the value to yes, and hit apply. Now that will store that in my test settings so that every time I run this test, it's going to default to yes at the start of the test, right? Now let's watch what happens in the middle of a test. So you would, whoops, pardon me, I'm going to go on to the next one. So in the middle of the test, if you have set one or more JMeter properties, we're going to add this remote control box up here in the test dashboard, right? And when you click the remote control box, you'll see this, and it'll already know properties that you pre-configured when you ran the test, right? And it'll tell you what the current value is, and this would then give you the chance to put in a new value and then hit send, right? And when you do that, it's going to literally change the value of that property on all the engines that are running. And it takes maybe upwards of a minute for it to propagate to every one of the engines. But from that point onward, you are going to be operating under that different condition. And likewise, you could obviously toggle this back again. And then this doesn't just work with third parties. You could literally have a row in here for every major feature that you want to be able to toggle on and off in your test and configure your test to use that approach, right? So the next one I want to cover is decorating headers to leverage APM, right? So by decorating headers, that may sound kind of fancy, but literally it's to add an additional header to all the requests that are going out that would tell the system on the other end some useful information. And I have an example here. If you notice I have CAPM here. If I click that, you get this dialog and you're given the choice to integrate using HTTP headers, right? If you were using the Dynatrace APM option inside our product, you get two options here, which is one, use the headers or use a system profile. System profile is a little more elaborate. That requires you to sort of log in, and it creates a beginning and ending point for your test, which is actually kind of less and less necessary in the current version of Dynatrace, because they're going to, if you do this header decoration, they're going to care about it and keep that data safe for you. So again, this will put in their case an x-Dynatrace header that'll have some interesting information. Let's look at what it would look like on their end if we did that. So you're running this test, and we're going to tell you what the front-end experience is on BlazeMeter side, but you're also probably going to want to know what's happening on the back end, right? And in this case, I have the name of my test that's running that's been sent in those headers. I have the name of the step in the test, sort of what in JMeter we would call a label. And I actually additionally know where the load came from geographically, and I know whether there was any impairments done to the network, right? Whether we were deliberately slowing it down. Now, so you could then ask yourself questions like, which of the tiers have an issue? We can see the traffic coming in. We can see how much of the traffic is going through the web server, how fast the requests are going downstream to other systems, and we can figure out where the strains are. You know, is it the database? Is the database the problem? Which you can see here, not. Or is it possibly the health of the JVM and the host that it's running on, right? So that's the sort of thing you can find out by decorating headers. Another name for this is red dye. You really want to, if you have those tools in-house, for goodness sakes, you want to leverage them and be sure that you're enhancing your scripts. And we make it easy, obviously, in our product by giving you those the checkboxes to add them. You can also add headers into your JMeter files yourself. So another tip I want to cover here is adjusting the request per second in flight to check for recovery. So I ran this test where I deliberately took it up where I knew I was going to see problems, and you can see that we indeed had some issues both with throughput and with response time here. And then I used the remote control feature to actually reduce the amount of load that was placed on the system and see whether it would recover. And sure enough, I got 0 errors after that point. And my response time was really nice. A little blip at the very end, but otherwise it was really great, right? And so I'll show you that in a sec when we go into the live demo. So the last thing I wanted to cover in terms of tips, and I'm really sharing all these tips because I want you to have sort of pegs in your brain to hang these ideas that'll help you build better tests and be more assured that you're really ready. The last thing you want to do is tell your boss you've done a lot of testing and then have things go wrong on the big day, right? So in this case, if you have a content delivery network, you really need to test it. And just for a quick review for those who are new to this, normally if you're not using a content delivery network, imagine people from all over the world are all going to your systems where you're running your app, right? And in CDN terms, this is what's known as an origin server, right? When you deploy a CDN, you have edge servers that actually handle some portion of the traffic. There's still an origin server in the middle here. And what happens, the reason why we need to do testing for this is not just to prove that the CDN can take traffic, because I'm sure they know they can take traffic, but your design calls for some portion of the traffic to flow only as far as these boxes and other portions of the traffic to go here. If somebody's creating a new account, they're going all the way to your core. If somebody's looking at a picture of an item in your catalog, they should be getting that from the CDN, right? And that will affect how well you can scale on the big day. So you need to test that that's actually doing what it's supposed to do. So let's move into the live demo here. And I just want to double check, Jason, you can see my screen okay, yeah?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was sandbox testing, and that was really how do I make sure that my test just runs when it's on BlazeMeter, right? And last night I created a test, and I deliberately broke something in the test just to sort of be sure I could show this to you, and then I ran the test, right? And here's that sandbox button, which is when you check this, we're always going to run a really small test. It maxes out at 20 users, and we're going to run it on a system that's running all the time, so you don't have to wait for the system to spin up. This test will run within less than a minute, right? And let's actually look at what happened when I ran that test, which is that right away I knew there was a problem because 30% of the time I'm getting errors, right? And I could figure out what the error was by heading over to the error page and take a look here, and I can see that I'm getting 404 not found for this reservation call. And what I did in this case is kind of a simple, easy thing to break, is I broke this URL. I made the URL wrong, right? Now, because there are transactions in this test, let me bring up the actual test. So this is the JMeter file that this is based on, right? You'll notice that there's a home page, and then there's a transaction controller called Book a Flight. And within there is the one that I broke, right? And if we look over here, we'll see that we're actually getting errors for Book a Flight as well, because that transaction is failing, right? And so you might have to dig a little deeper and figure out, yep, it was actually this is the real problem. So I figure out what the problem is and I fix it, right? So that's sandbox testing. More likely the reason why you're going to do this is because you've got a number of files in here, and maybe you've got CSVs that contain the names of usernames and passwords or product numbers in the catalog, and someone may have goofed and left a path in your test to that file rather than having it be in the current folder, which is where it's going to be when it runs up here, right? So then let's actually talk about calibration, and I'm not going to go into a long tutorial about calibration, but I'm going to point you to where the information is, right? So if I click on this calibrating a BlazeMeter test, what they're suggesting is you write a script, test it locally in JMeter, run it in the sandbox, and then set up the amount of users per engine using one console and one engine. So you basically, it's an iterative process where you will go through the steps of make sure your test works, and then once you make your test work, figure out how many users can run on one engine. And the way you're going to do this is you're going to look at the health of the test infrastructure during the test. This is healthy, memory at 8.9%, CPU at 4. This is basically just breezing along. In this case, memory at 92% and CPU at 99%. This is a box which is under stress, so it's not going to deliver meaningful test results. So that's why we do this calibrating, is to make sure that our test is not in the way. And then if you're going to be really big tests, we're going to teach you how to sort of cluster together a very, very large number of servers. And we'll look at multi-test as part of our demo in just a sec here, right? So let's pop back to my list of tests back here, and let's create So let's say we have a test already that works, right? So we've got this purchase flight flow, right? And we're happy with this, and we've learned a bunch of stuff from this, and we want to scale this up much bigger, right? So we go into create test, and we choose multi-test. Now, if you don't see multi-test in your account, you just have to ask us to add it. It's not a feature of free accounts, but it's easily added to your account. Just ask, right? And then I get this dialog, and the nature of a multi-test is it's just a aggregate of multiple pre-existing tests you already have created, right? And I could just take this purchase flight flow and drag it up here. I could do that a few times. I could also come down here and just choose it from here, right? And I want to have 5 of these, so I'm going to choose one more. All right, so now I have 5 of them. And by definition, when I first pull them in, they're all just identical copies of each other, right? If I wanted to add a little bit of diversity to this, I could pop this open and I could say, you know, I don't want this to come from I want this one to come from South Carolina, and I want this one over here to come from Virginia, and I want this one down here to come from Oregon. You get the idea, right? So now I've got it coming from multiple locations. And then I need to give it a name. Okay, and save it. And then when I go to launch it, it's going to tell me, okay, you're actually getting ready to run a test with 5 consoles and 10 engines and 10,000 total threads, and it's going to run for 10 minutes, right? And then by default, we're going to let you do what's called a synchronized start, which is that we're going to make sure that all those servers are ready before any of them start. You don't want some to get ahead of the others, right? And then we would hit launch. Okay, so I want to go on to another one, which is we talked about CDNs, right? And the deal with the CDN is that rightfully, they don't want you to create a giant load test that all comes from one place, because what's going to happen is that they're used to, if I go back to my slide deck, right, they're used to having the load spread geographically, because your customers are probably spread geographically. And if you deliver all the load to one place, you're probably going to melt this server and make them very unhappy, because you're going to knock their other customers offline, right? And so to do a proper CDN test, you have to have a distributed, geographically distributed population. The largest CDN is Akamai, and Akamai sets a standard, which is to say that you need to have 9 or more separate geographic locations for it to be considered valid, right? So I'm going to go over to this peak traffic test, which is already a very large test, testing with 90,000 users. And multi-location will show up here. And again, this is a feature you may have to ask us to toggle on for you, depending on what account you have. But I'm just going to show you how it works. If I click multi-location, we're kind of do the heavy lifting for you, and we're going to create a 9-location test, and we're going to assign 9 locations for you, right? So there's all these different locations here, right? And then you can override, you can change those locations, you can make adjustments to each of these. Maybe you decide that, you know what, I get way more traffic from the US than I do from Europe, so I'm going to actually make 4/5 of my traffic come from the US and only 1/5 come from Europe. And as long as you're still spreading the load across those nodes, your CDN should be okay with that. You could change the ramp up. You may want to make the ramp up longer to make sure you're finding things slowly, or you may want to make it faster in order to make sure that the CDN will spin up additional resources as needed to handle your traffic, right? And then obviously you can change the duration here. So that is how we get to the really, really big test and make your CDN happy. So I'm going to shift gears here, pop back to our presentation. And I wanted to share a couple success stories, because those of you out there, you know, it's one thing to think, oh, well, of course, the really big giant companies can do this and they do it all the time. But maybe I'm a startup, or I'm a mid-sized company, and can I really afford this? Can I really figure this out? And I wanted to share with you 2 companies, neither of which are particularly huge, but both of which have done some big commerce based on doing the right things and anticipating load, right? So the first one is Stance. Stance makes socks, customized socks. And they have their various peaks and valleys, and they do pretty well. But they had the opportunity to do a deal with Rihanna, and Rihanna was going to announce to her followers that she had this new sock collection that was available on the Stance website. Now, if you think for a minute, Rihanna has 80 million followers, right? So if you tweet out, hey, come check out my new socks, yeah, they're not all going to stop what they're doing right away and come, but an awful lot of them are going to come. And this was a site which was used to sort of having maybe 500 people on the site at the same time trying to buy socks. they had to be able to get quite a bit bigger than that, right? This was a recipe to either set sales records or crash really, really hard. And Rihanna isn't their only promotion. It's not the only sock they sell. They have customers that are buying socks every day. If the Rihanna thing were to knock them offline, they would lose the ability to serve their existing customers as well, right? So they made a decision to spin up new infrastructure on Amazon, and they wanted to figure out, well, how much do we need to spin up, and will it really scale? And they were able to ramp up their testing, and they tested actually 10 times their previous record for traffic, for concurrent traffic. As luck would have it, that's pretty much exactly what they got. They got about 10 times their usual traffic, and they ran for 24 hours straight and sold out of the entire inventory in 24 hours, right? So they came to us looking for help. We got them started. They love how easy it is to use BlazeMeter. There's a little quote here by their technology director, and so that's an awesome success story, right? Another one is movietickets.com, and they had seen that when The Force Awakens pre-sales went up, that people say it broke the internet, right? There were multiple sites that went down based on the pre-sales announcements for Star Wars Force Awakens, and they wanted to be ready for the opening week spikes of sales for people who weren't going to pre-buy, but who actually were saying, okay, the movie opens, I'm going to go shop for tickets, right? They also planned a migration to AWS. They had sort of a more traditional hosting situation, and they decided to move up to AWS to get the elastic ability to scale, right? And they had 2 months to make that migration happen and to test it to make sure it worked well. And they started with 30,000 concurrent users all up there buying tickets, and worked their way all the way up to 300,000 at the same time buying tickets, right? And they were able to service all the spikes successfully, capture tons of business, which was obviously a big revenue event with The Force Awakens, right? And as Craig Lefkowitz put it here, the director of infrastructure systems, people have really high expectations how it can perform. Performance is everything. If you can't serve them quickly, the customers will go elsewhere. It's not just about whether you crash. There's actually studies that show that if you slow down, people will be more likely to avoid you in the future than if you're flat down. Like if you're offline, they may come back again, but if using your site is tedious and painful, they will probably try to find other ways to get what they need. So as he said, our customers will go somewhere else. Load testing with BlazeMeter enables us to meet those expectations. So that is what I wanted to share in terms of scaling up to really big tests. But I want to take a second for those of you who are involved in shops that are trying to be more forward thinking about how you build software, how often you test software, and how do you reduce the drama of last minute project sort of hair on fire. I wanted to share a little bit about how you probably want to also think about planning for next year, which is we believe very strongly in doing performance tests as part of your continuous integration process. So as you build your code, you test it over and over and over again. Every time you touch your code, you test it again, right? And you can actually reuse a lot of the same assets you were using in your large test for this kind of testing. And the flip side holds too, which is if you're running these tests, when people change processes and how your business processes work, you're going to need to update those tests to make sure that they still work, right? So you're never going to have a backlog where you don't have tests ready to test your solution because you're always testing your solution, right? And you want to find bottlenecks as they're introduced, not as you're peeling the layers of the performance onion late in the game just before you're going to go live, right? And you can actually very effectively get a baseline on very small environments, not a performance environment, not a huge scale-up environment. If you always test on a server that can handle about 500 sessions, then what happens when you run those 500 sessions from one build to the next? They will change almost certainly if things are going wrong in your code, right? If you're getting less efficient. So you can learn more about that approach by going to gettorus.org. That is a command line tool and a testing as code domain-specific language we created to make it very easy to integrate your test into your CI process. It's much simpler than having a plugin that you always have to update the stuff in the portal. You can literally write your tests in the Torus code and go from there. So I've left about 10 minutes. I guess we're right on schedule. I've left about 10 minutes to get into the questions. If you would humor me for just a second, I'm going to go ahead and start looking at those. If you haven't asked your question yet, go ahead and post it now, and I'm going to take a look at, I'm going to take a look at these questions. Okay, so the first question I have here is a baseline testing before performance testing necessary? Um, so uh, baseline, in my mind, baseline is something you accumulate by doing testing over time, and something I didn't really show when we were in, let's see here, make this window a little smaller. Give me a second here. So when you run tests over and over again, right? I think I ran this one quite a few times, right? You're going to accumulate trend information, right? So when I think of baseline, I think of once you've kind of figured out what your app is supposed to do and you've run it a lot, you're going to get to kind of a new normal, and you're going to be able to watch that and compare over time what's happening. So the question was, is a baseline test necessary before you run a performance test? I think maybe the question is, should I run a test at sort of a nominal load, a very low level of load, kind of a non-stressful situation to establish what my baselines are, right? And I think you should. So if a busy day for you is 10,000 users, and a slow day is 1,000 users, run a test, 1, 2, 3, 4,000 users, and understand how all the various metrics look like under that circumstance. So you're establishing a baseline, right? Once you've done that, and by the way, this applies both for the data you have in your tests on our side, and if you have APM data, if you have any kind of back-end data you're working with, you also want to baseline that. This will also help you figure out kind of where the smoking gun is, where the problems are when you run your bigger tests. All right, so good question. Let's take another look here at the questions. Michael, the same person asked that last question, asked, does a load test become a stress test if the systems can't handle a load? Well, there's a lot of different words for how these different things work. If your intention is to actually hit the system really hard, either A, to prove that it can handle a spike, or B, to see where it breaks down when it does get under stress, then that test was from the beginning a stress test. Obviously, if you're just kind of proceeding along your path and you're ramping from 5,000 to 10,000 to 50,000 and the system gets into big trouble, then yes, your test just became a stress test, I guess. But it kind of depends what your intention is. How important for realistic load testing is the think time between the actions? It's absolutely, again, a great question. Obviously, Michael, you've been researching this a little bit because think time is super important. Think time is the time that a person spends sort of staring at a page before they do the next thing, right? If you're filling out a form, nobody fills out a form in 2 seconds. It's just not possible. And so when you're modeling what happens if X number of people show up, you want to actually really model how much, what those people show up, and you want to know how long they typically wait. And you can look at log files and possibly in your analytics to see how long people spend on a page before going to the next. And the reason why this is a problem is that historically many solutions were sold based on very strict licensing against virtual user counts. Like your license was either for 100 or 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 virtual users, and the jump in price from, say, 3,000 to 4,000 or 5,000 was huge. It's a giant jump in price. And so what people were tempted to do was take the same number of users and make them do more work. So instead of saying, I'm going to model my users accurately, they would say, oh, I'm going to make this one user act like 5 users. But the problem is that one user clicking as fast as 5 users would isn't the right situation. Your system has cookies maybe per user, has sessions per user. All this stuff gets lost when you sort of cook the test and mess around with the virtual user count. So it is realistic. It is a good idea to have good thinking time, and there are times where you just want to prove absolute throughput. If you're testing an API, for instance, there's really not a think time component, but if you're testing user flows, there absolutely is. Do you have an option to select a browser? Does this about browser testing or only server-side testing? Okay, so generally, we're going to run using JMeter or other protocol-based tools, JMeter, Gatling, the Grinder, etc. And those don't run a real browser. They can send browser identifying information if the content is going to change. But if you want to know what the experience is in a browser, you would also want to run Selenium alongside it. And we have the ability to do that using what we call a torus test. So we can actually run real Selenium browsers at the same time as your test and get the full details of what the user experience is. Running actual browsers in large scale is fairly costly and kind of impractical. So generally what people will do is a hybrid approach of both. Okay, another great question. So I'm supposed to do some testing of one of our systems which is not yet available on the internet, but is inside the company firewall. Is this possible to do with BlazeMeter? Absolutely yes. The way you would do that is using what we call our private location feature. If you've been following us for a while, that used to be called OPL, or on-premise location. And with that, you download a Docker container and run it on any host that can run Docker. And it makes outbound-only calls back to our SaaS solution and asks, should it be running a test? And then when you want to launch a test, obviously it keeps making these sort of heartbeat calls. Should I run a test? Should I run a test? And it then would launch a test. And you could run small, medium, large, or huge tests depending on how many systems you are okay to allocate on your side to load those Docker images onto. But yeah, that's absolutely an out-of-the-box solution we have. Does the free account include trend charts and multi-testing? Yes and no. So the trend charts, all the reporting is actually included in the free account, which is free forever. Multi-testing is indeed a feature which is only available for paid accounts. If you are considering and you want to be able to play with that before you actually make a purchase decision, absolutely contact our salespeople. They can set you up with a proof of concept so you can toggle that on and check it out. So you showed an example of decorating headers with Dynatrace. Do you have any examples of what it looks like in AppDynamics? Our integration with AppDynamics out of the box is to actually bring AppD data into our dashboards, and they then have our data and more on their dashboards. I don't actually have an example of what the headers would be. The AppDynamics actually provides quite a bit of flexibility here. You can actually define custom metrics in the header decorations as well. I suggest you just Google it and you'll find the details of what they allow you to do in the headers. We don't have an automatic way to inject that, but you would just follow the advice for how you would put it in your JMeter files themselves. I want to keep an eye on the time here because the questions are definitely piling up. Thank you guys for adding more questions. I'm going to scan through these questions and see if I can highlight the prioritize a little bit. Give me 1 second. Will the reports be available to see at real time when the test is under execution? Absolutely. That's one of the innovations we added when we created BlazeMeter. Was, one simple way to look at BlazeMeter is we orchestrate a large number of JMeter instances and we aggregate the data back in real time from those instances. We do a lot of other stuff too, like add the overlay of the APM data, provide trending over time, make it easier to share your reports, that kind of stuff. But that absolutely real time is not a problem. What's the best way to pinpoint bottlenecks that are not hardware related to find out if Apache is to blame? The site might itself be the slowest part, or so on. Yeah. So ideally, you want to have an APM tool on the back end. There are some ways to divine who the sort of culprit is from the front end. Things like you can look at logs. Are you getting way more requests on the front than are getting to something behind? The art of pinpointing the bottlenecks is really a mix of looking at what the symptoms are on the front and then gathering what data you can on the back, right? Question about geolocations. Different geolocations when you choose from BlazeMeter can be configured to have our own AWS EC2 instances sitting on our virtual private network. Yeah, absolutely. So if you wanted to run BlazeMeter inside of a virtual private cloud, you would actually use our private location feature, which means you would be spinning up those private agents inside your VPC, and they would again make secure outbound only calls to the main BlazeMeter instance to understand whether they should be running a test or not. Let's see here. How do you load test big events with multi-factor authentication virtual users? This is a scripting issue. So depending on the sophistication of your multi-factor auth, obviously you need to be able to have an algorithm you can use. JMeter allows you to call out and run Java, Groovy, JavaScript. There's many things you can call on the fly during the test on a user-by-user basis, and that's probably what you have to do is actually to compute the multi-factor authentication per user. So you need to understand how can you actually code for that and then decide which scripting language you want to code in or whether you want to go all the way to Java. Let's see here. What if you don't have a prod-like environment to do full-scale load tests? For the 2 case studies you shared, did they test in prod? So yes, they definitely tested in prod. I think that we're in an amazing point in history, though, because what's really happening is that as people move their solutions to the cloud, it's really not that hard to create an accurate replica of your entire infrastructure if it's all based in the cloud. In the real world, where you've got SSL accelerator hardware and you've got load balancers that are configured on a rack somewhere, it's tougher to create an accurate replica of production. But if you have, if you're lucky enough to have a cloud-based solution, people sort of stand back and do the math, and they realize, running my entire infrastructure as a duplicate of my infrastructure for an hour or 2 or 10 hours is actually not that expensive, and it's certainly a lot less expensive than creating the old solution, was that you'd create a disaster recovery solution that was most of, if not the same size as production. If you need to run on a staging environment, it can give you the obvious problems, but it will not give you the assurance that you're actually really ready. You really want to run against your production infrastructure at some point in your testing, and if you've got a hard rule against that, you can't really assure your management that when the big traffic comes through your infrastructure, you're really going to be ready. So you kind of have to try to fight that fight and look for a way to get it done in production if you can, and if not, sort of come up with the best plan B. Okay, 1 second. Right, so here's a common question, which is, if the maximum users on the site has been 1,000, then should we do testing for how many users? 1,500, 2,000? What percentage above the maximum load? So there's 2 aspects to this question. One is that you want to make sure that that count you have is really accurate, and you want to know what they do. Oftentimes people will say, oh, you should use 2 to 3 times the normal load, and that pretty much comes from a winging it, I don't really know whether my test is accurate place, as opposed to knowing that there's some magic you should go 2 or 3 times. You definitely want to be at least 30% above where you think you're going to be, and you want to make sure that you're being very realistic. If you're not confident that your test is realistic, then you should indeed go much, much higher and figure out where does it break, right? I apologize, I realize we're actually a few minutes over, and I want to be sure I get to those of you who didn't answer your questions yet. We have your questions and we can have people respond to you. I want to move on to kind of where you can find more information. And the first thing is that obviously we give away free accounts. All you need is your name and your email. That's it. To open an account, just go to blazemeter.com and click Get Started, and it'll ask you for your name and email and take you into the app. You can follow us on Twitter. We publish tech docs on a regular basis on our blog, and we usually announce them on Twitter. Our blog is at blazemeter/blog, and we cover a lot of topics: JMeter, load testing, performance testing, API testing, you name it. Spend some time there. It's pretty interesting, and it's written by technical resources. It's not a marketing vehicle. And then we have our resources page at blazemeter.com/resources, where you find recorded webinars and the like, and short videos too. And the last thing is, if you're interested about the open source tool for test automation I mentioned earlier, which is Taurus, go to gettaurus.org. I want to thank you guys for joining. Please do take the 30 seconds or so to answer the questionnaire at the end. And if you need more, you need somebody to reach out, I believe there's a place in the questionnaire where you can ask for someone to reach out and help you with more questions. Have a great day, and good luck with your own peak traffic events.